Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invite. It's an honor to be here in Dublin. In fact, my brother is a winemaker in southern Germany. And I'm always telling the anecdote that the wine producing sector is one of the few sectors which might benefit from climate change. German wine is getting ever better, so please buy German wine. No, but on a more serious note, it's a pleasure to be here. As you indicated, I'm in charge of a unit in DG Klima Action. DG Klima Action is new, exists since 1 year. It's a separate ministry, basically, or no, Directorate-General in the Commission to address really climate issues. And my unit is specifically dealing, amongst other things, also with with forestry issues. And this is important for various reasons. Now let me try to see whether I can make that work. Okay, thank you. I would like to present to you our views on that broad and big policy theme on forestry and the role of forestry in the EU's climate policy. Just to start out with some of the essential aspects, in the beginning I would like to point out why is agriculture and forestry, particularly forestry, really a special sector in terms of climate policy? Well, you see here some of the aspects. You see that on the one hand, agriculture is an emitter of various greenhouse gases. You see the nitrous oxide emissions, which are, for instance, associated with fertilizer use. You see also methane emissions, which are associated with livestock production. But then you also see that there is a CO2 uptake through trees, and that reduces atmospheric CO2. And then there is also soil carbon content, and that content in soils, in forestry and in agricultural soils can also be increased through certain production practices, which is very important. This is very important because on a global scale, forestry and land use, shown here on the right-hand side, do constitute an important sink of CO2, which is very important because on the other hand, we have quite obviously other sectors in which we mainly have emissions of greenhouse gases, and currently you see that there is still a net atmospheric growth of greenhouse gases. And the challenge is to bring that down in order to limit temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. So this together is the reason why agriculture and forestry is different than other sectors. If we talk about climate policies, we have on the one hand the emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture, but also to some extent from forestry, particularly if we look at tropical forests. Deforestation of tropical forests is a very big source of emissions. But then on the other hand, we have the fact that agriculture and forestry are very much concerned by climate change, by extreme weather events. You have seen the forest fires in southern Europe. You have had them in Russia. So forestry and agriculture feel the impact of climate change in a very direct way, more direct than other sectors. But thirdly, and also very importantly, these two sectors have the possibility to remove also carbon from the atmosphere through the use of bioenergy, biomaterials, and that makes this sector special. Let me very briefly, in the following 20 minutes or so, say something about the EU climate change objectives and what the role of forestry is in that context. Then say briefly something about forestry after Cancun. Let me thereby also say something about the broader policy framework, not only the EU internal policy, but also the external policies related to forestry. Then related to the future common agricultural policy, before I then come to my conclusions. What are the EU climate change objectives? You are very well informed, so you may have discussed them in other sessions, but it is clear that also for the EU as a whole, we have enshrined the objective to limit temperature increase to less than or to 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. And this will be very difficult to achieve. A lot more action will be necessary in the years to come and the next decades to achieve that. Then we have a EU climate energy package, which is associated mainly with the 3 2020 targets to increase energy efficiency, which is in fact one of the most difficult targets to be achieved among the 3 climate change objectives. Then we have the objective to increase renewable energy content in final energy consumption. And then we have the 20% greenhouse gas emissions target. And for the reduction target, we basically have 2 policy elements currently already in place. On the one hand, we have the emissions trading system, which relates to the energy-intensive sectors, and about 11,000 large-scale industrial and energy emitters in the EU with an associated target. Secondly, we have the effort-sharing decision, and in that sector, we have an emission target for those sectors which are not covered by the ETS. Yeah, all those sectors which are not covered by the first policy framework are under the effort sharing decision. And there we have a global reduction target for the entire EU of minus 10%. However, here in comparison to 2005. And agriculture is included in that effort sharing decision. However, if you remember the first slide, which I have shown, only certain greenhouse gases which are associated with agriculture, namely methane and nitrous oxide. On the opposite side, CO2, which is associated with land use and land use change and forestry, is not included in the EU climate policy framework. So it's not counted against a reduction commitment from the member states. This is one of the important messages from that slide. That means we currently have no framework to account the emissions or the removals which are associated neither with agriculture nor with forestry, in view of CO2 at least. So let me also briefly mention what was discussed in view of forestry in Cancun. There I have one message, that we have basically 2 approaches or 2 instruments which are twins. On the one hand, we have one instrument which relates to developing countries, which is REDD+, and on the other hand, we have LULUCF, which relates to developed countries. In principle, the fact that forestry is very important in the international negotiations is paying tribute to the fact that deforestation and degradation of forests is responsible worldwide for about 17% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really a significant factor contributing to the increase of atmospheric CO2. Therefore, finding a way to reduce such emissions is really a key component in the international negotiations. And in Cancun, 2 decisions were made. The one which I mentioned on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is related to tropical forests. That's in order to help really also developing countries to preserve, conserve their tropical forests, which is very important from a climate point of view, however, which is also important for other reasons, which I will also mention. And then the forests in developed countries, and they fall basically under LULUCF. And there also some progress has been made in Cancun. In view of REDD+, the EU objective is to seek to halt global forest loss by 2030 at the latest, and to reduce cross-tropical deforestation by at least 50%. And there we are in Cancun, certain steps how these objectives could be reached were discussed. And that's quite important because there are also various co-benefits of preserving forests, tropical forests, also in view of poverty reduction. Let me skip this one and then directly go to LULUCF. On LULUCF, in Cancun, a more moderate progress was made than for REDD+. LULUCF is in the Kyoto track. And as you may know, the negotiations on anything related to the Kyoto Protocol are a bit more difficult than any negotiations under the convention track. But at least one decision was made. The full accounting rules were not agreed yet, but it was agreed to count mitigation in LULUCF towards the greenhouse gas reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol, and to submit forest management reference levels for further review and further discussion, and this will be the basis for further discussions on LULUCF in this week in Durban, in Bangkok, and also towards the end of the year in Durban. So, in terms of LULUCF, moderate progress was made, but at least it was acknowledged that we have twins here in the international negotiations. We have REDD+ for developing countries and LULUCF for industrial or developed countries. Now, what role does LULUCF play in the climate and energy package? As I indicated in the beginning, in the introduction, LULUCF is currently not included in the 20% reduction commitment of the EU's climate and energy package. But at the same time, the directive is saying that all sectors of the economy should contribute to achieving the emission reductions. This would also include the LULUCF sectors, and therefore in the effort-sharing decision, the Commission, or with the effort-sharing decision, the Commission is required to submit a report which would assess how these emissions and removals which are associated with LULUCF could be included into a community policy framework, and as appropriate propose how to include the sector in community reduction commitment. For that purpose, we have worked during the last year very intensively with various stakeholders and member states. We had a stakeholder consultation in January in Brussels on exactly that question, and it's a non-trivial task because we are looking at natural processes. The emissions which are associated with LULUCF and forestry are associated with natural processes. They are difficult to account, to monitor, and to report, and therefore we first have to find harmonized modalities which would be agreed for all EU member states, based on which we could also ensure permanence and environmental integrity as well as accurate accounting and accurate monitoring of the emissions that are associated with this. From an EU point of view, LULUCF sector is important because simply in terms of scale, you see here on the upper hand, or this is the zero line. Above the zero line, you have emissions, and below the zero line, you have removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you also see that above the zero line, there are certain agriculture activities, cropland, for instance. Below the zero line, you have grassland, of which you have a lot in Ireland. Yeah? And then you have forestry, very much at the bottom, which indicates that the majority of removals, which is associated with LULUCF sector, comes from the forestry sector. And the task would also be, in the long term, to ensure that these removals would be preserved. Here, this is only a schematic representation of what the trend could be in this sector. Due to the increased demand for biomass, also for renewable energy production and other purposes, the net removals from the sector over time could decrease. And we basically have to consider also what possibilities would be available to maintain the mitigation contribution coming from LULUCF. We have indicated only a few. Afforestation, reforestation certainly could play a role. Improved forest management, improved cropland and grazing land management could also play an important role. And also creating a new pool for harvested wood products would be another possibility. Harvested wood product would basically mitigate, because it would ensure that CO2 removals would be removed on a more permanent basis than for other forestry products. Therefore, there is also a link to the Common Agricultural Policy post-2013. You might know that there was a communication published on the future Common Agricultural Policy last November, and that communication also very explicitly made a reference to climate change and to climate objectives. In fact, 3 new objectives of the Common Agricultural Policy were identified, and the second objective now reads sustainable management of natural resources and climate action. This is still preliminary because it's not enshrined in a legal document, but it's at least a declaration of intent. And the objective behind could certainly be to foster the transition to climate-friendly agriculture and forestry. There are possibilities under the various policy instruments of the first pillar and the second pillar. There were also some specific proposals made in that communication, and the question is also how these future instruments under the Common Agricultural Policy could be used to increase the removals of carbon through agriculture and forestry, because, as you might know, there are forestry measures in the second pillar of the Common Agricultural Policy. Support can be granted for afforestation through rural development policy. I know that Ireland has not made use of that choice, but at least in principle it is possible. However, what we are currently lacking is that a member state like Ireland would get credit for the associated carbon removals because we don't have a policy framework. Therefore, let me come to the conclusions. In the international arena, I think it's very important also for the debate between developing and developed countries that we basically have twin instruments relating to forests, REDD+ and LULUCF, to protect the carbon stocks associated with forests. LULUCF proposal would be important to count future incentives for CO2 reduction measures against the member states' reduction commitments. And then thirdly, maybe let me also make a more forward-looking comment. The question is also, I think that's also relevant for an economy like the Irish one, how we can make a transition to a sustainable and climate-smart agriculture and forestry sector. Personal views of mine are that we should better protect carbon stocks in soils and forests, decouple emissions from output, because we want and we will need to increase output from forestry and agriculture in the coming years and decades further. But we at the same time want to reduce emissions, maintain long-term food security and competitiveness, avoid carbon leakage between countries, and at the same time also sustain the natural resource base which we have in Europe. Therefore also ensure that environmental integrity and co-benefits for the environment would be taken into account when designing climate policies, also in view of forestry. Let me stop here. I hope I didn't speak too long. Thank you.